Hello audience, my name is Dalton Mortimer and I am the Authenticator. And welcome back to A Mystic's Vlogs, a show where we take a relatively serious look at media with explicit fantastical or supernatural elements through a magical, mystical, mythological, folkloric, paranormal, or occultic perspective. And incidentally, good evening, because this time on the docket we have Castlevania. Yes, to roughly coincide with Season 2, I thought we would take a look at what is arguably the best anime or other media adaptation of a video game as yet in history, Netflix's Castlevania. And sorry to those of you who might be wondering, we are going to be focusing most explicitly on the anime and the adaptation at this point, rather than taking into account the video games themselves. But just to prove some temporary nerd cred for myself, yes, this anime is largely based on Castlevania III Dracula's Curse in terms of plot and storytelling, and mostly based on Symphony of the Night in regards to aesthetic. Mostly. And my biggest question as a Castlevania fan moving forward into Season 2 is, will we see Grant this season, or will his abilities be split somehow between Alucard and Trevor, given that Thief's Gilding is probably not particularly necessary, given that two of our main characters are fairly good fighters, and we only have one sorceress. But there, geek credentials established and over, on with the show. But there's a slight problem, given that despite my unwillingness to go back and do retrospectives, I am a bit late to the party on this one, since this channel was not around when the first season, or should I say the first movie, of Castlevania Season 1 came out. Namely, that it was started as a movie and then was later turned into a series. So, here's looking back at the science, religion, and magics of Castlevania Season 1. We open, and I'm already potentially a little bit worried, when Lisa of Lupu, soon to be Lisa Tepish, finds her way to Dracula's front door and begs her for medical knowledge outside of the time period's typical constraints. Fortunately, though, given that this will be dispelled in a few minutes after Lisa has been taken erroneously as a witch and burned at the stake by the superstitious church, and Dracula retaliates by bursting into flames like an angry disguised fall teen and vanishing into a pillar of mystic fire, it dawns on me that most of Dracula's science is not out of place for something you might find on an episode of the old History Channel show Ancient Discoveries. Clockwork, Baghdad battery level electronics, and the occasional alchemy that might be burgeoning on the beginnings of chemistry if you squint at it hard enough. No, I think if anything, this is just an affectation of how just ancient Dracula is. Given the pedigree I've already just established to it, it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that even a magical being like Dracula would pick up some science in the event that he's been around for thousands of years, been in the aristocracy or the lordly class for that amount of time, is reasonably well read, and can remember thinkers like Archimedes and Heron. So it's not entirely unfeasible that he has some science at his disposal, in addition to his very explicit magics. A brief note before we move on, though, about this series' portrayal of Dracula. He is called Vlad Dracula Tepish several times, which is a nice nod to the fact that Dracula was actually the historical figure's middle name, given that he was the son of the dragon, given that his father was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a series of Romanian knights that fought the Muslims during several of the Crusades. Although it's probably a good thing that, for the most part, Vlad the Impaler's legacy is lampshaded, referenced, or just outright ignored, given that the actual historical figure was a few things primarily. The first Islamophobic, although a justified one, considering he was captured, sold, and tortured by them for most of his adolescence, and a Puritan who wanted nothing more than to alleviate his own stick up his ass by putting sticks up other people's asses for the majority of his life and scaring the shit out of people with psychological warfare and blood drinking. No, this Dracula is an unspeakably ancient entity who has been around for far longer than the actual historical figure would have been, considering the series is relatively concordant with the time period in which the historical Dracula would have been alive. I believe it actually opens the year after he is alleged to have died, and this Dracula has very clearly been doing his Dracula-ing for far longer than this, for millennia before it, perhaps, given that he is treated as a folk legend among the Wallachians. This actually opens up an interesting transition, and opens up an interesting door to a fascinating point of discussion. But let's get into that more as we go through the furtherance of the plot. After Drac and his girl have their little meet cute, it cuts to 18 years later, when presumably Lisa is an established doctor utilizing the knowledge gifted to her by Dracula to heal the sick and care for humanity. And Dracula, as a romantic gesture to her, is traveling as a man, wandering incognito Odin style throughout Wallachia. This quickly appears to bite him in his presumably still vacant neck holes, though, because in the process of traveling as a man, he completely misses his opportunity to do anything when his wife is taken erroneously as a witch by the hysterical church, wanting to maintain its metaphysical authority over everything relating to dogma and religion. Although, I have to ask, Drac, if she wanted you to travel as a man, you do realize you could still travel like an aristocrat, right? Like, horse-drawn carriages are still a thing. You didn't have to wander, but I get that the idea was to teach you some kind of humility, so maybe that was a stipulation she gave you. After an admittedly very bittersweet scene, where a very physically exhausted-looking Dracula comes very slowly up to where he presumes her residence ought to be, presumably because he has fulfilled his vows of her to wander as a man, and is now hoping to be all romantic and shit, and instead finds her shack burnt down, and presumably all the marks of being dragged away by the Inquisition, because nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, or I guess in this case the Romanian Inquisition, not even Dracula, apparently. After Dracula does one last quote-unquote act of kindness for an old woman who does both us and him the triply good favor of A, providing all the necessary exposition, B, reaffirming how awesome Dracula's wife was, and C, demonstrating the goodness of humanity that Dracula is apparently overlooking in his blind rage, Drac is pissed and takes this opportunity to, as I mentioned earlier, burst into mystic flames and teleport in a pillar of fire. It is at this point we cut to the two priests what did the dirty deed that is about to doom all of Wallachia, and I wouldn't be doing my job correctly if I didn't compliment this series on the excellent way it handles the boundaries between science, religion, and magic. Rather than saying they're synonymous with each other, or rather than saying one of them is synonymous with the others, each of them is separate but equally valid. Each of them has a utility and a modality unto itself that the other two simply cannot touch, as it should be. Rather, as it is alluded to many times throughout this series, only an idiot, the ignorant, or the dogmatic and simplistic would conflate any of the three of them in either direction. By which, of course, I mean that in the lore of Castlevania, as it is so very rarely overlooked to be depicted as, magic is neither an extension of religion nor an extension of science, and only the ignorant make this conflation. And honestly, I gotta tell you, as a more than 10-year veteran of the occult myself, I cannot quite express just how happy it makes me that they went with this way of depicting it. A slightly more accurate, in my opinion, way of depicting it that is very seldom used. Speaking of which, seemingly as a means of establishing and furthering this theming, we spend several scenes before Dracula shows up in an angry rage, with the Witchfinder and Bishop who bound, gagged, and apparently decided it was a good idea to burn Lisa Tepish at the stake. Then, of course, Dracula shows up, doing his Wizard of Oz, but this time for real routine, and he manifests in, of all places, what was formerly her funeral pyre, which I can't imagine helped his mood very much. If he could choose anywhere to manifest, I'm curious if he did that on purpose, and if he couldn't, and he was just bound by the rules of wherever the closest and most abundant source of fire was to present himself at the moment, that probably didn't help their case very much. Although, let's be fair, it probably didn't help his case very much either, considering no matter how much you say she was a woman of the sciences, Drac, if you manifest in a fury of fire in what remains of her funeral pyre after she's been burned at the stake, acting like an angry devil about to avenge her, they're probably going to take you as Satan regardless of the fact that you are not. Although it was interesting to see one of the priests react in the way of he was supposed to be a myth made up by heretics, alluding to the fact that rather than demonic forces, Dracula principally probably relates back to Wallachhia's pre-Christian or pagan days. Anyway, fascinating little thing that I noticed aside that might be confirmed or denied come season 2. Dracula ominously gives them 1 year to make their peace with their god and remove all marks that they've made on the land and get the fuck out of Wallachia. And then he disappears in a huff, causing a bunch of shattering glass, and apparently a bunch of meteors to fall from the sky. Impressive spell work there, Drac, although I'm not sure if you did it on purpose or if you were just that pissed. And with that, Dracula begins his 1 year of casting. Specifically, his 1 year of casting to summon forth the Night Horde. A holdover from the games that any Castlevania fan worth their salt will not need explained to them, so I won't. And I have to say, I really enjoyed the fact that it took him 1 year. Even Dracula. Because, despite the fact that Dracula has a ridiculous surplus of magical energy, the kind of operations that he is intoning with his attempt to summon the Night Horde are ones that would take any normal person possibly decades. And this is fine, given that A, Dracula has a massive surplus of magical energy, and B, he doesn't sleep. So things that would take the average person 2 to 4 years just to get the proportions and sigils right would only take him roughly 1 year because he doesn't sleep. So for 12 hours a day when most people would be sleeping, he is free to continue casting. And I have to also say that it might just be my misanthropy talking, but I'm having a hard time saying that Dracula did anything wrong here. Because, yeah, if the thing you love most in all of the world and the only reason you tolerate the stink of humanity burns at the stake as the result of people's ignorance and people call you Satan despite the fact that you're very obviously pagan in nature, yeah, I would certainly be at my wit's end with that too. Fortunately, for the sake of, well, humanity and also the plot, my sympathies for Dracula, #Dracula did nothing wrong, are not shared by all members of House Dracula. Specifically, in this case, not by Adrian Alucard Tepish, everybody's favorite Don Pierre, and the offspring of Vlad and Lisa, who attempts to put Dracula in touch with what could be charitably referred to as his humanity, and insists that he not summon the Night Horde. Fortunately, Dracula reacts about as well as any grieving person who just watched his wife be burned at the stake and then got taunted by the people that did it to his face. He rips out Alucard's throat, and Alucard has to spend his 1 year while Dracula is casting in a crypt later that will be revealed in episode 3 or 4, where he will hopefully be recovered from his injuries gifted to him by his own father. Castle Dracula really needs therapy. Like, the whole host of it. Just all of the therapy. All of it. Anyway, it is here where we experience a time skip past Dracula's 1 year. And it is also here where I am going to take a break and not cover episode 2, because nothing of particular note, at least not for what we're discussing, happens in episode 2. Short version, Trevor Belmont is a disgraced fuck-up who frequently enjoys getting drunk and getting in bar fights, and he finds himself in the last city that Dracula's demons have not yet laid to waste. Though this does at least provide us with a good excuse to once again cover the interesting and intricate relationships between magic, religion, and science within the Castlevania series, and how excellently it is handled. Since the Belmont family are essentially metaphysical experts, and since the church, being a religion and thereby very narrativistic, really hate practical metaphysical knowledge, the Belmonts have been excommunicate. Because, apparently, in the minds of the medieval church, protecting people from the supernatural with practical metaphysical knowledge and not narratives is apparently tantamount to just straight up dealing in black magic. Alright then. I'm also laughing slightly at how accurate to the actual medieval church's attitude towards anything that related to practical metaphysical knowledge as opposed to metaphysical narrative that this is. Good on you, Castlevania series. And with that, that'll take us to episode 3, and I need to cover the speakers, who are a wandering nomadic tribe focused on oral traditions, informal scholarship, and folk magic, with very heavily Eastern European accents. Yeah, they're basically the in-universe version of the Romani, also known as gypsies. Which, honestly, the term gypsy is slightly offensive to some Romani, so I'm not going to use it very often. Although, if you were to ask me, any viewers of mine that might be Romani, although I highly doubt it, I would suggest just owning it. Because, for one thing, nobody equates the word gyp to the word gypsy any longer, which is the thing that most of the people that get offended by this phrasing usually get offended by, and gypsy, frankly, just sounds cool. Also, brief side note while I'm talking about this, it is important to remember that not all Romanians are Romani, and not all Romani are necessarily even Romanian anymore. In the same way that not every denizen of New Orleans is likely to have Acadian in their bloodline. So, as much as we in the anti-SJW community like memeing the shit out of V, and V likes memeing the shit out of himself, a Romanian he is, but a Romani, I'm fairly certain he is not. Anyway, before I get too carried away with hashtag V is not a real gypsy, let's get back on track, shall we? The parallels between speakers and gypsy/Romani continue as they attempt to aid, heal, and counsel those that are distressed within the fortified city of Greșit, and are subsequently blamed by both the church and the primitive townspeople for the exact things which they happen to be attempting to alleviate in lieu of the fact that they are supposedly causing them. And once again, Castlevania seems to hit the nail so hard on the head of the medieval peasantry mindset that I can only stand back in quiet applause. And on that note, let's move on to the next relevant scene, where our hero Trevor will be fighting a Cyclops for the sake of rescuing a misbegotten speaker from its grip in an underground crypt, which is later revealed to house the healing Alucard. And unfortunately, I'm gonna have to ding Castlevania Season 1 with its portrayal of Cyclops again. Because, much like many other series, it seems to want to give monsters powers that they don't have, on the auspices that other monsters in the same sort of mythology did have them. In this case, it's giving a Cyclops the ability to turn people to stone, much like a Medusa or a Basilisk or a Gorgon. And it's strangely out of character for this series, given how much it gets right most of the time. Also, weirdly enough, when Alucard is questioned about the fact that there is apparently the equivalent of a Cyclops in what is relatively the equivalent of his drawing room, he calls everything in his crypt machines. So either he didn't know about the Cyclops, or he thinks that the Cyclops is mechanical in some way. But, fortunately, the Belmont training of Trevor didn't go to waste, and he successfully manages to kill the thing, albeit with some struggle, and things that it turned to stone slowly begin to turn back. Starting, of course, with the most recent victim, Sypha, who he is astonished is a woman, for one thing, and a speaker for another. Why he is surprised by the second one, I don't know, but he is. I think I might just be overthinking it, and in fact, this is an affectation of the writers going, well, even our hero has to be a little bit sexist because past era, derp derp derp. And I have no truck with it, and we're moving on. I don't particularly like being negative though, so let's move on back to something that I kind of skipped over. Namely, the speakers, and by extension the series' approach to the magics of prophecy. They give quite a spectacular representation of the fact that time is not necessarily linear, and as such it can be moved through in either direction through the means of magic. They often don't even use the word prophecy. What they use is quote-unquote information from the future, tying it back to the speaker's necessity of gathering folk magic and informal scholarship, which I really enjoyed. It gives a whole nother level of depth to their whole every bit of knowledge we have must be oral tradition thing, and being the, quote, avatars of all of the wisdom of Wallachia. Speaking of which, I quite enjoyed the fact that there was a delineation between what various speakers knew. For example, and this is particularly poignant considering they're the in-universe surrogates for Romani, yes, some of them do know quite a bit, in fact, about informal folk magic, but not every speaker does know magic. Just a specific set of them. Which is nice, considering that in most adaptations of Romanis, or gypsies as they're more often referred to, if you are a gypsy, then you know something about magic because reasons. Not so here. Magic is a specific kind of knowledge which some speakers possess, but not all of them, and it is a highly sought after skill that, while anyone can do, not everyone knows about. And with that, let's move on to the final episode of Season 1, and also, let's remark that the mystical accuracy here goes up so quickly and everything expounds so fast that I almost feel I need to install some kind of Cinema Win style win timer. But I would much rather that be the case than a Sins timer, so good on you once again, Castlevania series. Before we get to Sif's straight-up baseness and elemental magics, or Trevor's totally badass practical demon fighting skills, though, we have to talk about the scene. The best scene in the show, wherein our avatar for everything wrong-headed bullshit, narrativistic, or authoritarian about the church in the medieval time, that being the bishop of what is now Greshit, gets confronted in a church by a demon and is understandably flabbergasted about that. The demon, though, doesn't seem perplexed at all because, quote, "This is an empty box." And one is tempted to read this as slightly atheistic, but then you might realize and overlook the fact that this just means there's practical consecrating that a church needs to have in order to appropriately be the house of God, i.e. practical theurgical knowledge, and they didn't do it because they're so worried about anything resembling metaphysical knowledge, even when science resembles metaphysical knowledge, that they just actively avoided it. So yeah, you didn't consecrate your church, you didn't do any of the invocations to necessarily invoke it with any kind of Kabbalistic, Enochian, or other divine energies, and now you're eaten by a demon because the demon can just walk into your church. Sucks when you neuter your religion by removing anything vaguely mystical about it, doesn't it? Haha. Now, on very briefly, before we get into the proper demon fighting portion of the program, to Sifa, who is very fastly proving herself to be waifu material. Because she has probably the best line in the entire series when she conjures up a circle of fire to protect Trevor, and someone refers to her as a witch. And she goes full based, and it's awesome. Because she points out that in the medieval conception of the word witch specifically refers to someone who makes some kind of congress or deal or contract with a demon, and she has done neither of these things. Thus, she is a scholar of magic, but in the medieval conception of the word, she is not a witch. And I get to do a bit of a side rant about the evolution of that word through history. Because this, like so many things during the Dark Ages, did a little bit of a backslide that it took some time to undo. Considering that in the pre-Christian or pagan days of Europe, the word witch, which came from several Anglo-Saxon words, the most concrete of them being wissa, which, yes, in Latin, a double C is typically pronounced with an S sound rather than a C, so fuck you, Wiccans. Which means craft of the wise or wise crafting. So a witch was anyone who knew, essentially, what amounted to naturalistic folk magic, which is distinct from the kind of ritualistic high magic that probably would have prevented our priest friend there from getting swallowed by a demon had he actually employed some of it, namely theurgy. But of course, as the Christianization of the Dark Ages rolled on, and the importance of the priesthood became more prominent, anyone who claimed any better or superior metaphysical knowledge to a priest was taken as in league with the devil because authoritarianism, basically. And thus, the word witch became synonymous with everything that we actually in the business would call on the left-hand path. That being anything that deals with beings of lower spiritual planes, i.e., your various hell dimensions, your demons, your jinn, etc. Your unclean spirits, I believe is the way it's phrased in the Testament of Solomon. Moving on, as I promised, though, to Sifa's badass elemental magics, I did like that most of her magics were fairly simple in nature. She can conjure the elements. Because, of course, her magics are the result of folk knowledge and oral tradition, therefore they're going to be slightly sporadic and somewhat incomplete. And despite my lack of fondness for instantaneous gestural magic, they actually do something of their homework here, in the sense that the fingers are typically associated with currents of elemental variants of energy. Thus, her finger-tutting mechanisms through which she conjures her various elements actually have some logic to them. And it's also very purposely draining to her, given that she is focusing her energies on them. And also, there is a kind of pseudo-invocation she has to do with the various movements she does, so it's not just out of thin air or because I want to. She actually did, apparently in-universe, study this shit, and thus that is how she knows how to do this. And if you're going to take something that is more abstract and more metaphysical and make it more literal, it might as well be something as basic as element conjuring. Given, again, that she is an informal scholar of this shit, and thus her knowledge would be accrued through various bits and pieces of gathering and oral tradition. It'll be interesting to see if, like the magicians, the focus on the energies invoked through finger-tutting are a mainstay of her magic, or if she actually does practice ritual at some point. Anyway, that's Siffa taken care of for the moment, so back to Trevor. And the absolutely amazing scene where all of this focus on practical metaphysical knowledge and setting up magic as such in opposition to the narrativistic and authoritarian church pays off with him being the only one, apart from possibly Siffa, who can defend the good people of Greshit from an army of demons. Armed with salt, which I was very happy to see made an appearance, because of course salt has purifying properties and diffusatory properties due to its crystalline structure, and also him getting a priest to ordain some holy water. Although it made me laugh because of course Siffa could have done that, given that there are rituals within magic and theurgy that allow one to manufacture their own holy water through consecrating it with their own energy rather than invoking a divine one. Although it is possible that the series creators did notice this, because when Siffa conjures ice walls in order to box the demons in, the water within the ice appears to be quite sanctified in its own right, and they react to it in some of the same way as they do with the holy water. Now, I don't know if this means that the priest went and made an entire well holy for the sake of this, or if, how I'm choosing to interpret it, Siffa's magic, by virtue of it being magic, sanctified it in its own right, and thus the ice is minorly holy. I'm fine with the properly, quote-unquote, made holy water being more holy, but it's still funny to me when I know for a fact that there are spells to create holy water if her magic didn't alter it, at least metaphysically, in some way. Anyway, so he gets everyone to sanctify their weapons by rubbing it in the salt, which presumably, I hope there was some sanctification involved there, because if not, then it was a sloppy shortcut, which I'm more than willing to give you, Castlevania series, given how good you've been this entire time. And the demon dies after being beaten up with Trevor's consecrated whip, which was also nice to see. I am curious, though, if his whip actually has silver or iron spikes in it, which would make it all the more interesting because, of course, iron and silver disrupt negative spiritual energy in the same manner as lead disrupts radiation. But you can't expect them to get everything, so if it's not, and it's just a consecration, then I hope at least they went through the proper theological channels for it. And, of course, after this epic demon battle, they meet Alucard, but I think I'm going to leave it there for now, because nothing really of mystic import happens in that time, so I think I'll just leave it up to say that that's when our trio meets. And just like that, we're done for today, or at least done until I get a chance to watch Season 2. And regarding how I'm going to cover Season 2, I'm going to cover it episode by episode. The only reason why I covered this one in the whole is because I was late to the party and the whole series was already done and we had to recap. It'll be interesting to see what, if any, of my theories get expounded, denied, confirmed, or expanded upon, and what magical elements will get expanded upon as well. But until then, I think I'll leave it there and bid you all adieu, with my usual sign-off. Cheers, everyone. Cheers all, and I'll see you all next time.